Before dawn on the 19th of September 1944, the fields around the French village of Arracourt were buried in fog so thick a man could not see the far side of a road. Somewhere inside that fog, engines were moving. American crews in the outposts east of the town heard them before they saw anything, a low grinding of tracks and gears getting closer in the dark. Then the shapes came through the mist. Long hulls, sloped armor, the unmistakable outline of the German Panther, the newest and most feared tank on the Western Front. A major armored attack was underway, and the Americans in its path were a scattering of light tanks, a handful of tank destroyers, and Sherman crews who on paper had no business winning. The Panther was built to kill at long range. Its gun could punch through an American Sherman from more than a mile away, far beyond the distance at which the Sherman could reliably hurt it in return. In open country, in clear weather, that advantage was close to decisive. But the same fog that was hiding the Panthers as they advanced was also blinding them. A gun that can kill at 2,000 yards is worth very little when the crew cannot see 200. The fight was being forced into close range, into the short distances where a Panther's greatest strength counted for almost nothing. And in that fog, the Americans began to move. Instead of sitting still to be picked off, they used the murk to slip around the flanks of the German tanks, toward the thinner armor on their sides, toward the shot that could actually kill them. Over the days that followed, one of the largest tank battles on the Western Front would end in a result that seems to make no sense. The side with the better tank lost, and lost badly. This is the story of how that happened, and why the answer says something true about how tank battles are really won. There is a simple idea about tank warfare that almost everyone starts with. The tank with the thicker armor and the bigger, longer-ranged gun should win. By that measure, Arracourt should have been a German victory. The Panther outclassed the Sherman in armor and in gun range, and the Germans had more tanks on the field. Every specification that gets compared in books and online favored the German side. The battle came out the other way. The two German armored brigades that led the attack were wrecked as fighting units within days. The American force that stopped them lost only a fraction of what it destroyed. And the U.S. Army was so struck by the result that it studied Arracourt for decades afterward and taught it in its own schools as a lesson in how armored warfare actually works. So the better tank lost. Understanding how is the entire point of this story. The answer is not that the Panther was secretly bad, because it was not. The answer is that a tank battle is decided by far more than the tank. It is decided by who can see, who can move, who can talk to each other, who chose the ground, who trained their crews, and who kept their head. Hold on to that question as the fog rolls in over Lorraine, because everything that follows is the answer to it. By September 1944, the war in France had become a race. After the breakout from Normandy that summer, Allied armies had torn eastward across France faster than almost anyone expected. Leading the charge in the center was Lieutenant General George Patton and his Third Army, and at the sharp tip of Patton's advance was one of the finest armored units in the U.S. Army, the 4th Armored Division, commanded by Major General John Wood, a driving, aggressive officer his men called Tiger Jack. The speed came at a cost. Patton's tanks had outrun their fuel and their support, and their rapid advance had left long, exposed flanks. By the middle of September, the 4th Armored had pushed across the Moselle River and was concentrated near the town of Arracourt, in the Lorraine region of eastern France. It was deep in contested ground, out ahead of the main line, and it was exactly the kind of exposed spearhead that invites a counterattack. The Germans intended to deliver one. Adolf Hitler had ordered a counteroffensive against Patton's flank, and the job went to the 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel, a respected and experienced panzer commander. The objective was to hit the American penetration, retake the town of Luneville, and collapse the U.S. bridgehead over the Moselle. On paper, it was a serious threat, built around fresh armor. That armor is where the German plan carried a hidden flaw. The spearhead of the attack was made up of 2 newly formed panzer brigades. These were brand new organizations, and each was issued a battalion of the latest Panther tanks straight from the factory alongside a battalion of the older Panzer IV. On the surface, they looked powerful. Underneath, they were fragile in ways that would decide the battle. According to the U.S. Army's own study of the campaign, the crews in these panzer brigades were fresh but barely trained. They had been rushed to the front so quickly, and with so little fuel to spare for practice, that many crews had only a couple of weeks together. They had little skill in reading terrain, little experience maneuvering as large formations, and almost no practice in the coordinated combined arms fighting that modern armored war demanded. Their brand new Panthers still carried the mechanical troubles of any freshly built machine. and the brigades were poorly set up for command and control, which meant their attacks tended to arrive in pieces rather than as a single coordinated blow. The one experienced German armored unit in the area, the 11th Panzer Division, was a capable veteran formation, but it had been worn down in earlier fighting and was badly short of tanks. So the two sides that met at Arracourt were almost a mirror image of the myth. The Germans had the better machines and the weaker crews. The Americans had the weaker machines and, in the 4th Armored, some of the best trained tank crews and most capable commanders in the theater. To understand the fighting, you have to understand honestly what each side was driving, without the myths on either side. The German Panther, officially the Panzer V, deserved its reputation. Its frontal armor was thick and steeply sloped, which made it very hard to penetrate from the front. Its main gun was a long, high-velocity 75mm weapon that could destroy a Sherman at ranges well beyond a mile, and it was accurate at those distances. In a long-range duel across open ground, a Panther could hit and kill American tanks before they could even close to a range where their own guns would bite. That is a real and serious advantage, and it is the reason the Panther was feared. The American M4 Sherman was, in the ways most often measured, the weaker tank. Its armor was thinner. Most of the Shermans at Arracourt carried a shorter 75mm gun that struggled badly against the Panther's frontal armor. Head-on, at range, a Sherman was at a genuine disadvantage, and American crews knew it. But the Sherman had strengths that do not show up in a simple comparison of armor thickness and gun size, and at Arracourt those strengths were the ones that mattered. The Sherman's turret turned faster. It had a more powerful traverse motor than the Panther, which meant an American crew could swing its gun onto a target more quickly than a German crew could swing theirs. The Sherman also carried a gyro stabilizer that helped keep the gun steadier while the tank was moving, which made accurate firing on the move more possible. It was mechanically reliable and easy to repair, so more American tanks stayed running. And critically, American tanks had good radios, with a set in every tank, so crews and commanders could talk to each other constantly and react as a team. Set those two machines against each other, and a pattern appears. At long range in the open, the Panther dominated. At close range, in a fast, confused, moving fight where the first tank to get a shot onto an enemy's flank would win, the advantages started to shift toward the faster-turning, faster-talking, better-crewed Shermans. The Battle of Arracourt would be fought almost entirely at close range, in fog, in exactly the conditions the Panther liked least. The Americans did not get those conditions purely by luck, but some of it was luck, and it came in the form of weather. For days, the fog off Lorraine had been thick in the mornings, and on the 19th of September, it was thick enough to hide an army. That fog had already caused problems for the Americans, because it grounded the fighter bombers of the U.S. 19 Tactical Air Command that Patton's tankers relied on so heavily. On a clear day, German tanks caught in the open feared American air power more than anything on the ground. In the fog, that threat was gone. The weather had handed the Germans their surprise. But the fog took as much as it gave. It hid the German advance, and it also blinded it. The Panther crews could not use their long guns at long range because they could not see. Worse, they were advancing into country they had not scouted, against an enemy whose exact positions they did not know, because the Green Brigades had done almost no reconnaissance. They were driving into a fight half-blind. The Americans, defending ground they had studied, turned that against them. The first hard blow of the day came not from the Shermans but from their partners, the tank destroyers of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion. These crews drove the M18 Hellcat, a strange and specialized machine, and they fought by a doctrine built for exactly this kind of enemy. Early in the war, watching German tanks overrun everything in their path, the U.S. Army had decided that the answer to massed enemy armor was not a heavier tank, but a fast, hard-hitting vehicle that would rush to where the tanks were and kill them by ambush. The Hellcat was the purest expression of that idea. It was the fastest armored vehicle of the war, able to sprint at highway speeds, armed with a good 76mm gun, but so thinly armored and open on top that it could not survive a straight fight. It was built not to slug, but to dart, to ambush, and to run before the enemy could hit back. In the pre-dawn fog near the village of Bézange-la-Petite, 4 Hellcats of Company C used the mist to creep up close to a company of Panthers from the German 113th Panzer Brigade. Firing from a low fold in the ground at close range, where their guns could bite and where the Panthers could not see them coming, the 4 tank destroyers knocked out 7 Panthers before the sun was even up. 7 of the most feared tanks in the world, destroyed by 4 thin-skinned vehicles that any one of them could have killed with a single hit. because the Americans got in close and got in first. This was the mechanism that would repeat all across the battlefield, so it is worth being clear about why it worked. A Panther's protection was concentrated at the front. Its thick, sloped frontal plate could shrug off American shells at almost any range. But its side and rear armor was far thinner, thin enough that even the shorter American guns could punch straight through. In a stand-up fight from the front, the Panther was nearly untouchable. Caught from the flank, it was as vulnerable as any other tank. Everything the Americans did at Arracourt, the fog, the ambushes, the fast turns, the flanking runs, was in service of one goal: to stop facing the front of the Panther and get a shot into its side. Later that same day, the German brigade pressed its attack toward the American command post near Rechicourt-la-Petite. Again the Hellcats of Company C met them, under the direction of Captain Tom Evans, and again they used deception rather than brute force. Evans let his lead platoon sit as bait, drawing the German tanks' attention and their guns, while his other two platoons moved unseen onto the enemy's flank and opened fire from the side. Across the 19th of September, the pattern repeated everywhere along the front. German tanks pushed forward blind, American tanks and tank destroyers used the fog and the ground to get onto their flanks, and the Panthers died from side and rear hits before they could bring their frontal armor and long guns to bear. The American Shermans of the 37th Tank Battalion, the core of the defense, fought the same way. They did not try to trade shots with Panthers at long range, which would have been suicide. They used their speed, their fast turrets, and their knowledge of the ground to close in, flank, and fire first. Even the artillery joined the killing directly. When German tanks broke through toward the American headquarters, gunners of the 191st Field Artillery Battalion cranked their heavy 155mm howitzers down level and fired them straight at the tanks over open sights, at ranges as short as 200 yards. By the end of that first full day of battle, the German attack had gained almost nothing. According to the U.S. Army study, the Germans reported losing around 50 tanks on the 19th of September alone, in exchange for no meaningful ground. The better tank had been thrown at the American line and had come apart against it. What makes Arracourt more than a single lucky morning is what happened next. The Germans did not accept the result. They came back, again and again, for days, and each time the same thing happened. On the 20th of September, as the 4th Armored pushed forward under Patton's orders, a German brigade struck at the division's command post from behind. Once more it was artillery that met them first, the big-toed howitzers firing over open sights and knocking out the lead tanks until the rest pulled back. A relief force of Shermans hunted down and destroyed several more Panthers. This became the rhythm of the whole battle. The Germans would mass for another push, drive in, and run into a flexible American defense that shifted tanks, tank destroyers, artillery, and infantry to meet them, killed the lead vehicles, and threw the attack back. The men leading that American defense were a large part of why it held. Colonel Bruce Clark commanded the combat command at the center of the fighting, and his tank battalion was led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, one of the most gifted tank commanders in the entire U.S. Army. Their style was fast, aggressive, and improvised. When German tanks appeared, American units did not wait for permission. They moved to the sound of the guns, coordinated over the radio, and hit the enemy from directions the Germans did not expect. Against green German crews who struggled to maneuver and whose attacks kept arriving piecemeal, that flexibility was devastating. On the German side, the picture was the opposite. General von Manteuffel was an able commander, but he was trying to run a coordinated offensive with tools that would not coordinate. His panzer brigades could not reliably scout ahead, could not easily talk between units, and could not maneuver as trained formations. So instead of massing their armor and striking one heavy, concentrated blow, the Germans fed their tanks into the battle a piece at a time, a company here, a dozen tanks there, each thrust running into the American defense on its own and being destroyed on its own. It is one of the oldest ways to lose an armored battle. 100 tanks committed together can overwhelm a defense. The same 100 tanks committed in groups of 10 over several days get killed in groups of 10. The Germans had the numbers to win at Arracourt. They never managed to bring those numbers to bear at the same time and place, and the Americans made them pay for it every time. Then, on the 21st of September, the weather finally broke, and the last German hope went with it. For the first days of the battle, the fog had protected the German tanks from the one American weapon they feared most. On the 21st, the skies over Lorraine cleared, and the P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers of the 19th Tactical Air Command came back. For German armor caught moving in open country, this was a catastrophe. The heavy, fuel-hungry Panthers that had been trying to maneuver against the American positions were now exposed from above to aircraft that could hunt them with bombs, rockets, and cannon. Over the course of the battle, American fighter bombers were credited with destroying or knocking out dozens of German tanks. The fog that had given the Germans their only real advantage was gone, and with clear skies, the full weight of American combined arms fighting came down on the Panzer brigades all at once. Now they faced Shermans and Hellcats on the ground, artillery firing over open sights, and thunderbolts overhead, all coordinated, all working together. The German attacks continued into the following days, and the 22nd of September brought the most dangerous of them, because this time the attacker was not a Green Brigade, but the veteran 11th Panzer Division. If any German force at Arracourt could have handled itself, it was this one. But the veterans ran into the same trap the brigades had. The morning of the 22nd opened once more in thick fog, and the fighting began around 9 in the morning when German infantry and about a dozen tanks fell on the American screen of light tanks and quickly destroyed several of them. Then the Hellcats of the 704th came forward again, knocked out several Panthers, and pulled back into the mist, and the American Shermans deployed to meet the thrust. Even a skilled, experienced German division, attacking blind through fog into a prepared and coordinated American defense, could not make headway. It lost tanks it could not replace, and gained nothing worth having. By now the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Panzer brigades had been shattered. Their attacks had grown weaker with every attempt, and they had nothing left to show for the tanks and men they had spent. The one veteran division thrown in behind them had bounced off as well. Here the story requires care, because the numbers from Arracourt are a good example of how messy it is to count losses in a tank battle, and how easy it is to repeat a claim as if it were a fact. You will often see it said that the Americans destroyed 281 or 285 German tanks at Arracourt for tiny losses of their own. That larger figure comes from what the American 4th Armored Division claimed over the wider Lorraine campaign, not a confirmed count of wrecks on the Arracourt battlefield. Claims made in the middle of a fast, confused, smoke-filled battle are almost always higher than what a careful later count confirms. Tanks get claimed by more than one crew. A tank knocked out and later repaired gets counted as destroyed. A vehicle abandoned in fog gets tallied by whoever saw it last. Every army in the war overcounted this way, so the honest way to state it is that the Americans claimed a very large number, and that the true number of tanks permanently destroyed was lower than the claim. What is not in doubt is that the German losses were severe and the American losses were light. The U.S. Combat Command, that bore the brunt of the fighting, lost on the order of 25 tanks and 7 tank destroyers. Across the wider Arracourt region that September, the 5th Panzer Army lost well over 100 Panthers and around 100 more Panzer IVs, along with a large number of assault guns and tank destroyers. One accounting found that of the roughly 260 German armored vehicles committed, only around 60 were still operational when the fighting died down. Whatever the exact figure, the shape of it is clear. 2 German panzer brigades built around the best tank on the Western Front had been destroyed as fighting forces, and the American units that did it had walked away largely intact. So return to the question this whole story is built on. The Germans had the better tank. They lost anyway. Why? The answer is that at Arracourt, almost everything that decides a battle other than raw tank specifications favored the Americans, and those things mattered more than the specifications did. Start with the crews. The American tankers of the 4th Armored were experienced, superbly trained, and led by some of the best armored officers the U.S. Army produced. The German crews and the Panzer brigades were brave but green, thrown into their first major action with only weeks of training, unable to maneuver well or coordinate as formations. A better tank driven by a worse crew is not a better weapon. Then visibility. The fog that covered the early days neutralized the Panther's single greatest advantage, its long-range gun, and forced the fighting into the close ranges where the Sherman's faster turret and the Hellcat's speed and ambush tactics decided things. Then reconnaissance and ground. The Americans knew the terrain, had scouted it, and fought from positions they had chosen. The German brigades advanced blind, with almost no reconnaissance, straight into an enemy whose positions they could not see. Then communications. Every American tank had a radio, so American units fought as a coordinated team that could shift and concentrate in minutes. The German brigades were poorly set up for command and control, and their attacks kept arriving in disjointed pieces that the Americans defeated one at a time. Then maneuver. American doctrine and American crews used mobility as a weapon. They flanked, they ambushed, they got onto the thin side armor of the Panthers rather than battering at the thick front. A Panther hit in the flank died as easily as any tank. And finally, combined arms. The Shermans did not win alone, and the honest version of this story does not pretend they did. They won as one part of a machine that included the fast-striking Hellcat tank destroyers, artillery that would fire its heaviest guns straight down the throat of an attacking column, and, once the skies cleared, fighter bombers overhead. The Germans brought better tanks. The Americans brought a better system, and a better system beats a better tank. That is the real lesson of Arracourt, and it is why the U.S. Army studied it for decades. The comforting simple idea that the side with the thickest armor and the biggest gun wins is wrong. Tanks fight as part of a team, in weather and terrain, guided by training and communication and command. Arracourt is the clearest proof of it on the Western Front. The Battle of Arracourt wound down at the end of September 1944. The German counteroffensive against Patton's flank had failed completely. Luneville was not held. The American bridgehead over the Moselle was not broken, and the 5th Panzer Army's attempt to cut off the 4th Armored had cost it 2 panzer brigades for almost nothing gained. The new brigade organization that Germany had rushed to the front was judged a costly failure, and was soon reorganized out of existence. The victory did not end the fighting in Lorraine, which ground on brutally into the autumn mud and would grow far harder for Patton's men in the weeks ahead. But Arracourt had shattered the last serious German armored counterstroke in that sector and confirmed something important about the U.S. Army in 1944. Its tanks were not the best in the world, and its soldiers knew it. What the Army had instead was a way of fighting, combining tanks, tank destroyers, artillery, air power, training, and communications into a whole that could beat heavier and more famous enemy machines. It should not be forgotten that the men in those tanks paid for the result, on both sides. A tank knocked out is not a clean thing. Crews burned inside their vehicles, or were killed by the shock and steel of a penetrating hit, or climbed out wounded under fire. The American losses at Arracourt were light only by comparison with what they inflicted, and the German crews who died in their new Panthers were young men sent into a battle their training had not prepared them for, by a plan that asked more of them than they could give. The lesson of Arracourt is a hard one about how battles are won, and it was written in the lives of the men who fought it. For Germany, the strategic price was heavier than any single day's tank count. The 5th Panzer Army had been assembled for a purpose, to cut off and destroy the spearhead of Patton's army and throw the Americans back across the Moselle. It failed at that purpose completely, and in failing it, burned through armor that Germany could not replace in a war it was already losing. The Panzer Brigade experiment, meant to rush new armored power to the front quickly, had proven that tanks without trained crews and sound command are just expensive targets. The men who led the American defense went on to remarkable things. Creighton Abrams, the young tank battalion commander whose aggressive handling of his Shermans helped break the German attacks, rose after the war to become chief of staff of the entire U.S. Army. When the Army designed its next generation of main battle tank decades later, it named that tank the M18 Abrams, in his honor. The commander who at Arracourt proved that a lighter tank in better hands could beat a heavier one, gave his name to one of the most powerful tanks ever built. Arracourt answers its own question in the end. Germany brought the better tank to Lorraine, and Germany lost the tank battle, because the better tank was in the weaker hands, on the wrong ground, in the wrong weather, fighting blind and alone against an enemy who could see, move, talk, and strike as one. The Sherman did not win because it was the better tank. It won because everything around it was better. In armored warfare, that is what actually decides who walks away. Arracourt was won by men who could see what the enemy could not. Next time on Warfront, we follow a force that had no such advantage, ordered to hold a position against odds that left them nowhere to maneuver and no way out. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe to Warfront, and the next battle will find you.